Good afternoon to you. Mark out of HurricaneTrack.com here with your hurricane outlook and discussion for Wednesday, October the 2nd, 2019. I hope your Wednesday is going well. Before we get into the discussion, I want to point out something that I finally looked into at the encouragement of a few people recently, and that is defining and explaining what this is all about. Oh, look at that terrible little line there. Let me beef that up a little bit, and we'll make it red. What is this all about? What do we call this? And we've seen these little curlicues, these waves along the equatorial region for years. You know, when we look at the anomaly map here, you can see these, and there's other ways to visualize this as well. And so what are they, and what causes them? Well, I did some digging, and finally, after procrastinating for years, those are called tropical instability waves. And it is a fancy way to describe basically kind of like a shearing mechanism that happens when you have different currents going in different directions, and then you have this upwelling of colder water over this region. You also get them from time to time over here in the Atlantic, but right now they are most prevalent in the tropical Pacific, and they tend to be most prevalent when we have a La Nina kicking in, not so much during an El Nino. And if you notice, when we have an El Nino, that warm water profile just sets up like this. And I'll try to fill all this in and show you. You know, that's what an El Nino looks like. But when you get these cold upwelling events that try to go towards La Nina, which is what the ocean is trying to do right now, at least it seems, you get these interesting little waves, and they're called tropical instability waves. And basically, the easiest way for me to describe it and visualize it is, you know, you have a current that goes this way, and then another current at a different depth coming the opposite way, and that leads to these little eddies that form. And it's interesting that the wave period, these little waves, is about 30 days, roughly, and they stretch out, and they can go for thousands of miles, all the way over towards Indonesia, if the mechanism is strong enough. They're very interesting because they do things with the amount of life and biology in the ocean, and you can see it through different methods of satellites, like the chlorophyll in the plankton and all that. A very fascinating phenomenon when you start to look into it. So Google tropical instability waves. In fact, I'll put a link to it in the description off of Wikipedia, and then there are more references. There are several papers written about it over the past decade or so, and it's actually a very, very fascinating phenomenon that has both meteorological and oceanographic implications and impacts, as well as biological, because colder water has more nutrients than does warmer water, generally speaking. And so sometimes, like I said, you can see these reflected not only in anomalies from sea surface temperatures, but also when biologists look at the level of chlorophyll in the ocean. It's amazing, isn't it? So tropical instability waves, I'll put a link to it in the description. It's kind of like if you sit in the jacuzzi or the pool or the bathtub or whatever, and you move your hand across the water, just underneath the water, and you can see those little ripples, those little eddies that spin off of the motion of your hand going through. That's kind of like what these are, kind of. Okay, that's one way to look at it. They're little anticyclonic swirls that develop in here, and they usually get started near the Galapagos Islands right there. And it takes them about 30 days, and maybe they peter out farther to the west. But if there's enough energy, they keep going. So there you go. Check it out. I'll put it in the description, and then read more about it yourself on the internet, the world's biggest library. And it's all true, right? Right. All right. So what's happening in the tropics? Well, first of all, I mentioned this yesterday. When you can see the outline of this super-duper ridge over the eastern parts of the lower 48, that's incredible. This very deep-layered ridge of high pressure all kinds of records. You're hearing about this left and right. It's October 2nd, and outside in my office here in Wilmington, North Carolina, it's in the low 90s. It's just crazy, crazy, crazy hot. And the overall pattern is part of the Madden-Julian oscillation being stuck in phase 1. There are other factors at play here that are causing this, and it's going to be interesting to see how this hangs around or whatnot over time. As we go through October, we will get a front that will finally come through this area and cool things down. But then I think it's going to reload, not be as strong, because we are getting later in the year, the sun angle is getting lower, and it's just not going to be able to be quite as hot, thank goodness. But this type of a pattern also will eventually foster development down in the Western Caribbean. I firmly believe that. I'm very confident that that's going to happen. So what else is happening? Well, here, of course, we have the post-tropical circulation of Lorenzo after passing over the westernmost portion of the Azores. You've seen probably some of the video from that on social media. So what does this mean that it is post-tropical? I talk about this often, and especially more this year than ever before. These names that we as human beings give to anything are simply labels to classify systems in our environment, whether it be the biological world, the geological world, or the meteorological world and the oceanographic world. Whatever the case may be, we give these systems scientific names, and the scientific name is tropical cyclone. We call them tropical storms, tropical depressions, hurricanes, typhoons, whatever. All right? So that's just a name that we give it. In this case, what used to be a classic hurricane that came from the Cape Verde area and moved across and did its work going up through here is now post-tropical, a label. That is the scientific term for it. It is still very much windy with hurricane force winds, enormous waves, and heavy precip in some of this over the ocean and getting ready to spill into Ireland as an example. And we'll look at this from a different perspective in a moment. So don't think of these things as being less problematic because their name changed. And the greatest example of that in the modern era, I think, still is Sandy, Hurricane Sandy from 2012. That it became this post-tropical ex-hurricane as it pinwheeled in near Atlantic City, but yet it's one of the costliest storm systems in United States history, and it killed a lot of people, relatively speaking. I mean, more than one person is too many, honestly, and that is another example that it's just a label that was given, you know, that it still brought a massive surge, high wind, power outages for millions, and it had hurricane force winds and low air pressure and all the other factors. So you folks in Ireland and the United Kingdom, you have a hurricane force beast headed your way. All right, that's my label for it, okay? And I really like what some of the weather agencies are doing. I think it's the UK Met Office that refers to it as Storm Lorenzo, and that's good. It is a storm, and I mean, you guys are smart enough to know this, but just kind of outlining, you know, it is post-tropical, it's losing its tropical characteristics, but those are just scientific ways of looking at this. The impacts to you folks in the path of this, and that includes my brother and his family, they live in London, this will be significant. So we'll focus on this more in just a moment. I'll show you a really neat way that we can track this. Changing my color here. Look at this. This right here we got to watch. It may try to develop over the MDR, the main development region. We'll put a big question mark here. Or maybe it waits till later. Hard to say. But this is another healthy tropical wave. October, right? I mean, normally this stuff is over by now. But that is one vigorous tropical wave. We will see what happens with that as it gets out into the Atlantic. Energy over here that's going to end up over in the Bay of Campeche, and it may try to develop and get pulled to the north and east with time. We shall see. energy in the southwest Atlantic, south of Bermuda there, trying to do something. So there's still activity trying to do something, but nothing to really kick it along yet. That missing ingredient, not every disturbance develops. And thank goodness for that. As much of a passion as I have for tracking and then studying hurricanes when they make landfall, I'm glad that they don't all do that, because it would just be too much to bear, honestly. And so the fact that they are rare is indeed a good thing. Now, you folks down here in the Windward Islands, tropical wave and some energy heading your way. So Trinidad, Tobago, Barbados, and the southern windwards there, everybody down there, look to your east. High clouds moving in, and you will have rainfall and some gusty winds. And that's probably about it. There's just not much of an impetus to really get this thing going, but you do have some disturbed weather headed your way. All right, so moving along to the track here of Lorenzo. Again, this is what you need to be looking at. Gigantic tropical storm force wind field, that itself would cover easily the United Kingdom and Ireland. I mean, easily. And then the hurricane force wind bullseye, would easily cover all of Ireland. All right, so just think of it that way. It's also going to be pushing out, and has been pushing out, enormous waves. So any of these coastal areas that are exposed, even over here on the western parts of the United Kingdom there, you could get storm surge. And it's just going to be the favored locations where you have onshore flow. And remember, this is still going to have counterclockwise wind, and so these southwest-facing shorelines in here could really get some surge. And then it turns the corner, and things will change. So good thing about it is that people up here, I won't say they're used to this, but this is not some exceptionally rare anomaly. Large ocean storms come into this part of the world fairly frequently over history, so you pretty much know what's coming. You have history as a guide, and so just be smart out there. I'd love to see some video. I just want people to be careful. There will be probably some pretty big power outages through here, and then eventually this energy will get into northwest Europe, and that could be interesting too. All this energy originated over Africa as an impulse, embedded in the easterly trades many days ago, and now it's going to end up eventually in northwest Europe. Just an incredible phenomenon. Sadly, it'll have impacts that make people's lives miserable, and we have to take that into account and be smart and make sure we survive these kinds of events, and we don't do something dumb, like hanging out right at the edge of a cliff or the rocky coastline to film something, and a huge wave sweeps you away or whatever. Please be careful out there. It's going to be an interesting event, but we don't need to have people's lives lost trying to document it. So just to get you oriented on the geography of the region, this system, again, will move in with the center of it, something like that. But who cares about the center? Just this huge wind field is going to come in and really stir up the place. Okay, it's going to be rough and tumble, whatever you want to call it, heavy rain. I think it's going to get a little warmer as it passes through, just a little bit of that tropical energy. It's not all gone, so you'll see the temperature come up a little bit, and heavy rain bands, so forth and so on. It's interesting over time. You got Dublin here on the east coast of Ireland, and London, obviously the largest city here in the United Kingdom, also on the eastern side. It's not quite on the coast per se, but they're not on the west coast. Dublin's not over here. I know there are cities over here, yes, but these folks knew going all the way back, that's why this is part of the old country, that your largest cities, probably need to be sheltered from the storminess that resides from time to time. If we zoom in here, you can see, there's, people live all over the place now, but these very large cities here, London is not perched right here on this peninsula, for example. Yeah, you got Liverpool, Manchester up here, but in the course of history, most of our largest cities have tended to be away from the sea. Sometimes they're not, like Amsterdam or New York or whatever, but I just wonder about this sometime, especially going back to hundreds of years ago and even longer, when settlement began. You tended to avoid the exposed coastal areas. So interesting times coming up. Starting now, really, these effects will be moving in, and this will all be encroaching across the region through tomorrow and through Friday. So I'll be looking forward to tracking that, and we can do so in this case with the vorticity. And I think this is a great way to track this. This is the energy in the atmosphere, the spin. And look at that. I mean, it's white hot. I mean, not really. In fact, let's change my color to purple. That is like, to be able to see it like that, to visualize this, and to get into the math and the physics behind this, well, forget about it. But just think about it as a skater pulling in their arms when they are figure skating, right, on the ice, or roller skates. I guess you could do it with roller skates, and they spin faster. It's called the conservation of angular momentum, and on Earth and other planets, but especially Earth, this is where we live, when it's round like that and the energy is bundled, that means it is potent. There is a lot of energy, a lot of spin in the atmosphere, and when it's that round, you know that it is focused. And so I don't care if it's post-tropical. When I see that, I say, wow, that is energy headed for somebody. That's trouble. And so you can look at the clouds, in the satellite animation, and you look at this and you go, yeah, that's not that impressive. But then you look beneath the clouds. This is why I say going and kind of checking underneath the hood, so to speak, of the vehicle. What's under there? What you got under there? Well, that's a heck of an engine. And all of that energy is going to head into this area. So we will track this over time. I cannot wait to show it tomorrow. I'll probably tweet this a couple of times on my Twitter and talk about it on Patreon. But that's what you can really track there. And I'll put a link to where you can track this particular graphic in today's discussion description as well. All right? All righty. So that's the present and the short-term future. What about the long-term? I know, because I see just like you guys do, that the GFS has created a little bit of a stir on the 12Z run. So I want to talk about that just a little bit here. And show you what we've got. Now, this is a different way of looking at the GFS off the INSEP site instead of Tropical Tidbits. I just want to try something different today, just a different perspective. This is the initial setup. You see this little disturbance down here. This is 5,000 feet in the atmosphere. Another disturbance over here. Your anticyclonic flow of this deep layer ridge over the southeast. Here's the east coast of the United States, so forth and so on, Central America, Cuba, and the islands. All right, so let's just kind of scroll or whatever through this. I think I can click on it, and then I want to back out. There we go. Now I can just tab through, and you watch what happens over time. This is, every hour at first is very high resolution, dense data, and as you go through time, there's 48 hours, and things move merrily along. You notice that, and we'll just stop here for a minute. Nothing down here really gets together in bundles. There's a little reflection there, a little low pressure there, but little perturbations in the wind fields, those little wind flags, but that's about it. There's nothing else really to hang your hat on, nothing to worry about. So we keep going out through time. You can see that front coming by up in the top part of the map here. And then after we get about 96, we'll go back a little bit. 84 to 96 hours and beyond, there's a little bit of a disturbance down here that approaches the northwest Bahamas. Well, that could be interesting. We'll see how that tracks. I think it's going to come up and turn ahead of this trough that's coming through. But that's not what has everybody's attention, at least not yet. So let's keep on going. 100 hours out, so forth and so on. Now we're getting out to day 5, 120 hours. Nothing really grabs your attention just yet. And finally, at a week's time, right, there's a week right there roughly. Notice the trade winds down here, pretty much straight east to west. Very important to note that. All right, and same thing generally across Central America into the eastern Pacific. This is pivotal. So a week out, still have pretty good trades just blowing right across. But as we get past about a week out, look what happens. Subtle, but it's there. Now you're starting to get these westerly winds that come in, this sort of large cyclonic gyre that tries to set up way down in the southeastern Pacific, and then it begins to manifest itself more and more into the southwestern and western Caribbean. So by the time we get out to days 8, 9, and so forth, more of this in here, really starting to curl up. All right? And so what happens, this sort of Central American gyre, as we call it, takes shape, and so that by day 10, 240 hours out, it starts to pinch off some energy north of Costa Rica and Panama, another piece of energy south of El Salvador, Guatemala, in the eastern Pacific, and then it just takes off, as the GFS tends to do. And you see what happens. The energy gets bundled and focused in the Northwest Caribbean Sea, and you have the makings for one heck of an end to the hurricane season, right? So you go and you look at this, you're going to see it on social media. I want to explain it. What are we going to look for? First, we know that this is pretty far out in time, but look at this pattern here, this obvious cyclonic gyre that has set up down here. Very large pocket of energy and wind shift, whatever you want to call it. That meteorological calling card is very easy to see if it starts to happen. Okay? So this is where we can watch over time and see if this happens. We start getting the first inklings of it, like I said, after about a week out. We go back just a little bit here, and we'll go to 192 hours. That's 8 days out. And so by day 8, that's not that far out in time. It is starting to set up pretty prevalent there in the Southwest Caribbean, also pretty prevalent there in the Southeastern Pacific. So, all right, we'll see. That's far enough out that you go, well, I'm not too worried about it, but it's not 300 hours out. It's not 10 days out that we see the beginnings of this. So now, each day that we go forward, let's see what happens with this over time. All right? And that's how we can approach that. The MJO, still going to be favored for phase 1, maybe a de-amplification of it finally towards the middle of the month. We'll see about that. It wouldn't surprise me if it just kind of stays where it is. But the climatological time of year we're in, the part of the region of the basin that would happen, all the other there's enough evidence to suggest that we pay attention to this, that something could develop down in that region that could be worthy or not. But because it's not way, way out, 300 hours in time, whatever, it's got my attention just a little bit more today. We'll put it that way. All right, that is it from me for today. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. You folks in Ireland and the UK, heads up. You know what's coming by now. Love to hear from you on social media, on YouTube, part of social media, of course, and, of course, our patrons on Patreon that live over there. I'll be talking about this a lot on Patreon as well as on Twitter. You can see me there on @HurricaneTrack, and we'll keep track of what's happening with the remnants of Lorenzo, Storm Lorenzo, as they call it over there. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. Again, thanks for watching. I do appreciate it, as always. I am Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow.